Hi, this is Josh Marshall, and this is the Josh Marshall Podcast. We have our co host, Kate Riga, back. Kate was away last week, so we had an off week at the podcast. Now we're back, and we have a lot to discuss. For months, I've been saying that we're in this period of the politics of opacity, particularly up in the Senate, where we just don't, all the all the stuff that's in public is meaningless, and all the stuff that is meaningful is happening out of our eyes. And so, is there going to be infrastructure? Is there not? Is there going to be voting rights? Is there not? Well, kind of all of a sudden now we're actually doing stuff, and we do know what's happening. It's happening in a fairly public fashion. We have two, back to that old thing of these, linked processes with these two different pieces of infrastructure legislation. You have the bipartisan mini deal, which is kind of kind of inching its way forward. Kind of everybody trying to figure out. It's kind of it's a bit different than we're used to in really in the last dozen plus years, where occasionally we have bills that everybody agrees on and it just kind of passes through and you're done. And then you have bills that Democrats want to pass and Republicans just prevent them from doing anything. And everybody knows how to do that now. Everybody has those muscles exercised and strong. But now you have this thing where Republicans are kind of letting it happen and kind of sort of some of them supporting it, but also wanting to make it slow and kind of wanting it not to happen, and and they're trying to figure it out as they go along. So we're going to talk about the current situation with the president's infrastructure program, and we're also going to talk about the latest on the January 6th investigation and Jim Jordan and stuff like that. And then we're going to talk about the fact that we're back in COVID. How much we don't know exactly. And I've written a few things about this on the site in the last week. It's really hard to know what is going on. It's really hard to know what is going on. We're all kind of and this isn't to make light of it. We're all kind of past masters now at living under COVID. And what I mean by that is after however many months or whatever, we had a basic understanding of how COVID works and what it does. And here's what you do to protect yourself, blah, 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 blah. Here's this does this does that. The vaccines have this level of efficacy. And then in the last couple of weeks, suddenly everything was kind of unclear again. And you're hearing these like wildly different things about the vaccines. Uh, Suddenly we're kind of flooded by a lot of anecdotal information. Everybody knows people who've had a breakthrough infection. And that's kind of unnerving, because even though everybody who has paid attention knows that vaccines are not foolproof, I think most of us kind of thought, you're vaccinated, the pandemic is mostly over for you if you're vaccinated. And then we've had everything that, I don't have to go through all the details for you, everything that has happened in the last month or so. But what is salient to me is that we're in a reality that is only a month or so old, in the sense of the Delta variant is now the dominant, almost exclusive version of COVID operating in the United States. We also, at least until very recently, had basically, kind of all the mitigation was done. We had certainly a majority of the adult population vaccinated. And suddenly what happens with those variables was really not clear. And so you're kind of falling back on anecdotes, and you've got this, situation in Provincetown, Massachusetts, that everybody's like, oh, people who are vaccinated can get it and they can, spread it. And is that true? Is that not true? So we're going to talk about all of those all of those things. And but before we do, let me remind you that the Josh Marshall podcast is brought to you by Grady's Cold Brew Iced Coffee. It's here to help you cut through the heat this summer. Their famous New Orleans style coffee stays fresh in your fridge, so you never have to wait in line, pay coffee shop prices, or leave air conditioning. Concentrated and strong, Grady's tastes great however you take it. Black and bold, light and sweet, even spiked with an adult Four Loko. And Grady's is the best cold brew value around. Order a 6-pack of bean bags, and you get 72 servings of cold brew shipped directly to your door for only $45. And shipping's free. If you're ready to give it a try, get 25% off your first order at Grady'sColdBrew.com with promo code TPM. That's Grady'sColdBrew.com with promo code TPM. So, Kate, you're back. What's up?
I'm back.
Yeah.
Yeah. Had a nice little vacation down at the Jersey Shore, like the good Philadelphian I am. Got my first jellyfish sting.
Oh, wow.
So eventful.
How bad was it?
It wasn't bad, but it was kind of freaky because
Do you
I
get that
did
kind
feel
of
the
tingly
tentacle like
ting?
wrap around my leg.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. It's always a little weird because like I had a couple years ago I was down in the Yucatan Peninsula and I took my sons fly fishing with a guide. And one of the sometimes you go out and you sort of walk on the flats, and I got one of those things. It's kind of one of those things where it wasn't like so much a sting as my legs started feeling kind of zingy, kind of
Yeah.
like, and the vast majority of jellyfish it just stings, and it is what it is. It's annoying. And I asked the guide, I said, what kind of, am I okay? Can I just ignore this? Right. And there's a bit of a language barrier. And he's like, yeah, almost always okay. And I'm like, dude, that's not helping me. Like, what's the deal? So, all right. So the jellyfish and what else?
Yeah, so jellyfish came after both me and my boyfriend, felt very pointed. My family and we all watched many, many, many hours of Olympics. So, ask me anything you want to on foil fencing because I now consider myself an armchair expert. And it was really the first time I have pretty much since I've entered this industry, since I've ever taken a week off of Twitter, a total week off. And I really only did it because kept spoiling the Olympics for me thanks to the time difference, but
Right. Right.
ended up
Right.
kind of being a lovely purge or a
It's
little
it's
break from the negativity.
it's great if you when you can do that. I think probably like a lot of other people, I have not, I haven't taken a vacation during COVID because well, until recently it kind of wasn't that easy to travel, and
Hmm.
kind of hard to distinguish what's vacation from what's being locked down, kind of
Right.
whatever. But when before, in the before times, I was not always able to do it, but I would at least try to totally turn off, right? Just kind of drop out of that thing, because I think like a lot of people in this business, it's a lot of hard work, but it also, for me at least, it's also an obsessive behavior, right? And so it's hard to, it's not like a job that is, at least for me, it's not like a job that is kind of like, oh, so glad to be home and be done with it for the day, and kind of doing it 24/7. So that's always a when I can do that, it's great, but
Yeah.
it's hard to do,
Exactly.
for me at least.
Yep, exactly. So yeah, now that it's funny, I kind of we came back to a slightly different world than we left. The some mask mandates were put back in place in DC. Um, you know, kind of it seems like a surge of these high profile breakthrough cases. We had Lindsey Graham test positive. He has been vaccinated, and then you find out, well, he was just at Joe Manchin's houseboat soiree with a bunch of other
Does
senators. So
Manchin live on a houseboat?
yeah, in
He
DC.
does. Okay,
Hmm.
yeah, because it's always
The almost heaven. Say what you
okay.
will
Yeah,
about the man, but that's a perfect name for a boat from West
yeah. Well, it's
Virginia. That's really
well,
funny.
there's a whole history, rather sordid history with houseboats, right? Because Duke Cunningham lived on a houseboat.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So there's all, yeah, and it was, and I can't remember the exact details, but like some lobbyist either gave it to him or sold it to him for $20, or there was some aspect of the scandal it was called the Duke Stir. Get it?
Dumb.
Duke Stir, Duke
No,
Stir, right? Yeah. So
bad. Not as good
yeah,
as the Almost Heaven. Sorry.
yeah. No, 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 no. It's not good. It's cringy, but yeah.
Yeah.
Um.
Yeah.
So
So,
yeah. So that's where but again, it's one of these. It's kind of like I was saying. Things have changed, but it's not clear how much things have changed. And what I mean by that is, there were a lot of journalists, and this is, it's hard. It's hard being, dragooned into doing science journalism if you're not a science journalist. And when science and epidemiology become central to the news, it's hard. It's hard, and it's hard when public authorities don't know everything, and it's hard for them to convey. And there's, I'm sure you've heard about this whole, July 4th Provincetown thing. And there was a while last week where it kind of sounded like people were saying, like, hey, being vaccinated, yeah, fine, it's going to keep you out of the hospital, but basically you can get it easily and you're going to spread it to everyone. And suddenly, like, whoa, wait, what's going on? I mean, clearly
mhm.
that's not true, but we still don't quite know where things are at, and so it's a little unclear how to behave,
Right.
what behavior should be.
Right. So while this is swirling around, we're kind of in the final stages, it seems, of the bipartisan bill, which seemed to die many deaths on the way to get here. So in a way, it's kind of shocking. And now we're in the amendments period. So far, we've seen kind of a handful of bipartisan, kind of boring, kind of mundane amendments pass pretty easily. There have not been so far a ton of Republican kind of, poison pill amendments. So I know Ron Johnson is bringing one up about the border wall today. And now, kind of the question swirling around this, which is a similar question to one we've been asking the whole time, is okay, when is Schumer going to, snip, snip, cut it off? Because McConnell's been saying, oh, slow and steady wins the race. Like, let's just keep this amendment process going. Because as we know, the longer the process, the happier Republicans are. So now we're kind of in this limbo of waiting to see when Schumer cuts this off.
And so just so I understand and our listeners understand, so basically we're operating here under the filibuster rules, the 60 vote rules, and it's with the understanding that at least 10 Republicans are probably going to allow this to come to a majority vote. And I guess to start the debate, it was actually, I think, 17 Republicans.
Mm-hmm.
So sort of, an overwhelming vote to
Yep.
start, but they're kind of holding it out there, kind of like, don't push us too fast, or we're not gonna. So there's kind of, I mean, it's sort of going back to what I said a little while ago. Everybody's used to the two other things, the China innovation bill, like, yep, done, we all agree, let's push it through,
Mm-hmm.
done and done. Or just when Republicans don't let you do anything. But here, where it's kind of up in the air.
Totally.
And I guess, and so in theory, you could just keep doing this forever, just keep doing amendments forever. But so now it's kind of, a lot of the Democrats is like, dude, okay, you did your million amendments. We're
Right.
we're moving forward now.
Right. And it's exactly as you say. And I think Schumer, is trying to walk a line where, like most of the amendments so far have been kind of earnest, well intentioned amendments. So, he doesn't want to kind of cut off Republicans who are earnestly trying to be part of the process. But the difference is they can both want to be earnestly part of the process and see it in their political interest to drag it out. So, there's some
Be
kind of
earnest for a really long
intertwining.
time, basically.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I noticed that
Exactly.
there was, I mean, I have not been following this part of this that closely, just the sort of the mundane amendments thing
Hmm.
that closely. But I noticed yesterday there was one amendment that was, I think, Raphael Warnock and Ted Cruz
Hmm.
had a one they did, and what it was pretty anodyne. It didn't. What was it?
Most
Or
of them have been like that. I'm not sure exactly which that one was, but yeah, most of the kind of, earnest ones have been Republican Democrat teams so
And
far.
and that kind of that is it's so unknown these days. That's what the legislative process is supposed to be,
Right.
right? You have the sort of the you start with a piece of legislation, and one person says, "Hey, I think we should add this or add that," and you vote on it. And you kind of and they're kind of deals and everything. It's like uncanny. No one's used to that,
Right.
right? Especially
Exactly.
when kind of like, wait a second, you're not. I mean, we've gotten used to with what they call these vote-a-ramas, just kind of vote, 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 vote. That it's like all poison pills.
Right.
Just I'm gonna make you vote this. You're gonna make uh, all that kind of stuff. So it's just weird actually having a kind of a momentary sort of appearance of legislation,
Right.
of the
Yeah.
legislative process.
Yeah, Tom Carper from Delaware has kind of been charged with shepherding the amendments process through. And he talked to some reporters yesterday and was basically like, "Yeah, I don't expect it to go this well forever, but it's nice right now. Smell the roses, appreciate that it's working the way it should for now, at least." So I think that's kind of where we are.
Right. So walk us through where we are in the bigger sort of structural process of this moving forward. Presumably it will get there's two votes. There's the vote to let it be vote on, and then there's the actual vote. Presumably it's going to get enough votes on the first one to get to the second vote. But there's this dance where you got to keep the moderate Democrats happy that their bipartisan thing got respect so that they're on board for the reconciliation vote. And some of this whole I mean, because for our listeners, it may seem like, all right, they're doing the bill. If they do amendments for 3 more days, like, who cares? It's not like we're running low on days, but in fact we are running low on days because there's a reconciliation. So walk us through the two-part thing. Where are we on
Right.
that?
Right. So, with reconciliation, kind of now that we finally have the bipartisan bill fully defined, it's almost 3,000 pages. So, you can say definitively at this point what's in and out. And that has kind of sparked off this mad scramble of advocacy groups to get their provisions that either they feel were underfunded or were passed over altogether in their bipartisan bill. Now they want that into the reconciliation bill. And we're kind of at the point with reconciliation where we got that top line that seemed to be broadly agreed on. I don't think Manchin really talked about it in much specificity, but the 3.5 trillion. And the next step with that is to kind of break it down into allotments for each committee who's going to handle it. They're going to do the legislative text, send it back to budget committee, budget stitches it all back up, and that's kind of the final product. But we're still in these early stages where everybody is jockeying for their provision to get money. And because the moderates are kind of twitchy about spending a lot of money, it creates a situation where money for something is going to come from money from something else. So we're starting to get into that area. And then timing wise, some groups who I've been talking to are just being very kind of gung ho about the idea that the House can't take up the bipartisan deal before the reconciliation bill is, more advanced, to keep those things in tandem, like we've been
Mm-hmm.
talking
Mm-hmm.
about, to ensure what they were worried about the whole time, which is that moderates will get their bipartisan bill passed, say, see ya, we're not going to spend this much more money, and not be there. So there is still, a big insistence on keeping these two things interconnected. And then looming over all of this is we have the August recess coming up, which is when typically the Senate would, disband, go back to their home states, fundraise, kiss babies, that kind of stuff, for a few weeks before they come back.
Now, isn't Pelosi though backstopping that
Mm-hmm.
issue? That kind of like they can say whatever they want, and people in the House can say whatever they want, but Pelosi's the one who has to bring it to a vote.
Yep, which he's
So,
been very consistent on up until
so
this
do
point.
they do to the extent that and it's funny, labels get very hard to define in these cases because we just had this special election in Ohio last night where Nina Turner, who's a big sort of a Sanders person but has been she ended up supporting Jill Stein in
Mhm.
2016. There's that kind of progressive, or the squad progressive. But when we talk about progressive in the context of these infrastructure bills, we're talking about a big chunk of the Senate Democrats. So it's a different, it's a more
Yep.
expansive definition. So to the extent that those people are, kind of a little wary, wanting to keep these things, joined, and I assume there's kind of comparable stuff among the House Democrats. To what extent those people are they confident? Look, Pelosi's just not gonna bring it to a vote. Are they confident that she's back stopping that, and that's kind of
Yeah,
done?
that's been my impression. I would say actually members seem to be a bit more comfortable on this front than the outside advocate groups, which I guess makes sense because I'm sure, when I'm talking to people in like the climate immigration reform, these are people who've been burned before. So
Yeah,
they're wary. But yeah, I would say that, I mean, to give Pelosi and Schumer credit on this, they kind of never wavered off the two-track thing. Even when Republicans were throwing a fit about it, they were like,
right.
no, we've been doing this from the beginning. This is what we're going to do. So
Right, right. Well, I guess also, I mean, just to defend the, sort of outside activist groups, it's never great to say like, "Yeah, I'm sure we're covered.
totally.
I'm not worried. I'm sure you'll take care of us." Right? I mean,
Mhm.
it's you always and that's not a matter of that anyone's being honest. Like, verify, but what is it? Trust but
Trust but
verify.
verify.
Yeah, yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Well, and especially a lot of these groups, particularly the environmentalists, see this moment as absolutely critical, cannot miss, cannot be excluded from this. So I think that's just kind of heightening everything.
Mhm, mhm. So let me ask you this. So there was a few, I don't know when exactly, a couple weeks ago, maybe it was even when you were away, that Kirsten Sinema made this thing kind of like, "Oh yeah, and also I'm not down for 3.5 trillion." And it was a I think people overinterpreted it because obviously it's easy for her to say like, "Oh, it's a little too high. I'll go for, 3.4995 trillion," just another more performative bullshit from her. But to the extent that so there's kind of two ways to look at this. There's the top line argument. Are we down with 3.5? And then obviously within 3.5 various things could get as much as they want or not get as much as they want. But are people concerned about that? Are people concerned about cinema still? Like, give us a sense of that.
It's funny, I haven't really picked up on a lot of concern about it. And think I think it's because it's one thing for her to kind of say she loves the filibuster. I mean, she's not the only one saying that, right? So
Hmm.
it doesn't matter what she does. She kind of has like she has a buddy. And then that's kind of been true for everything that she's taken her hardline stance on. It's just she
Right,
hasn't been out on a limb on her own. And
right.
the idea that she would sink this huge progressive historic piece of legislation, I don't know. I'm skeptical.
Yeah, I mean that's definitely. I mean, I wrote a post about this when you were away. I mean, I interpreted that. I mean, there was a lot of knee jerk responses like, "Oh my God, this is the betrayal. Everybody's been, she got her bipartisan mini bill, and now
Mhm.
and she didn't say that. She just basically said, "Oh, I'm not sure 3.5 is gonna work for me." But again, you knock off 50 million, and suddenly she's gotten her whatever. Um, but I made this point. I think you're exactly right. She's a phony. She's from a purple state. If she's on her own, she's going to fold. There's no way. I mean, there's just no way that is going to fly in the Democratic caucus, and she will fold. And so that makes sense to me that people aren't terribly. I just see it as. I mean, I don't know what her deal is. I don't know what kind of is motivating her at this point, but she's almost become sort of like a troll in the context of Democratic coalitional politics. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know if you saw this. She did this thing a couple days ago where she told Schumer like, "My vacation plans are set in
Oh my
August,"
god, I saw that.
which just kind of like, what do you say to that?
Right.
Right? I mean, it just it is it's like when she did that thing with what was it, like the unemployment insurance, the little kind of uh
Or
what
the
is
curtsy thing?
yeah, like a little
Thumbs down
curtsy.
curtsy? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I'm really curious. Like, I haven't seen any polls on this. Like, I'm curious. What is her level of support among Democrats in Arizona right now?
I mean, the only one I've seen, which you might have seen, it's a few weeks old at this point, but I think it was Data for Progress and Adam Gentlison, who we've had on to do an insider briefing, a former Harry Reid aide. He kind of broke it down in a Twitter thread, and the upshot of it was basically like, yeah, Republicans like her better than they like Mark Kelly, but they're going to vote for the Republican. They're not going to vote for
Right.
her. And then
Right.
she ultimately, if I'm remembering correctly, Kelly's much better with Democrats, but I don't think she was even better with independents than he was. So it's kind of like, what's your game?
Yeah, I
What's
mean,
the
it
upshot?
wouldn't surprise me if, like, I would not be surprised to see a poll that showed her, relatively high approval with like maybe like 40% approval from Republicans just because they like what she's doing.
Right.
But no, but that doesn't mean they're going to vote for her. I mean, that's
Exactly.
obvious, right? So I don't know what's going to happen with it. I mean, she's not up until 2024, so
Right.
who
Yeah,
knows?
and I think the kind of top line statistic from that poll that a lot of people were talking about was it was something like 63, just over 60% of Democrats said they would rather vote for a primary challenger who was committed to getting rid of the filibuster. So I think a lot of people kind of
Wow,
latched onto
60%. So
that.
basically she goes into a potential primary with 60% of Democrats saying they want to vote against her.
Right. I mean, and it's obviously,
I mean, it's 2 years, it's a long ways away, all
long
that kind
way
of stuff,
away.
but that's not great. That's
Well, and it
not I
makes
mean, that's
sense
yeah.
because it's like you say, it's almost everything she does really just seems totally absented from any kind of moral or ideological positioning. It just kind of seems like she picks sporadic things that won't get her in too hot of water with the Democratic caucus, but that will strategically piss Democrats off.
No, and this is the thing. I mean, people obviously Joe Manchin drives people crazy, but I think the vast majority of Democrats who understand the sort of the political context in West Virginia, understand his background, sort of like, look, if we didn't want to take Joe Manchin's crap, we should have elected a few more Democrats
Right.
from blue states, and here we are, and kind of like, and the other thing, it's funny. I remember talking to a person at the White House about this. That as much as he drives them crazy, he has not really upset the apple cart for them.
Yep.
He hasn't done something where kind of like, man, you fucked us, and now we're it's over. A lot of hand holding, a lot of annoyance, but at the end of the day, he's usually there. Now, obviously, some stuff like on voting, kind of like you can't really say end of the day because we haven't gotten to the end of the day, at least in theory. But
Right.
so yeah, it is a total mystery to me what her kind of what her political end game is. Because again, that vacation thing,
That
that's just kind of like saying
baffling.
like it's just like a fuck you to like every Democrat, everybody who thinks this is important, kind of like your vacation.
Well, and to
I
some
mean,
degree, like
really?
every voter, that's her political calculus stuns me again and again. But I just, who does it win with to be like, I, a public servant, am going to prioritize my vacation over the job I was elected to do? Sorry, tough. Like that's who I am. I'm a maverick. Sorry. I don't understand how that fits with any kind of winning political thing.
Yeah, I really don't know. I think it has to. It's sort of one of three things. One is she actually doesn't want to run for reelection again, and some people bring that up, but I doubt it. You don't run for Senate and not want to. I mean, she's not like some business person who kind of
Right.
did it on a lark or something like that. I mean, she's been in politics for her whole adult life. She was in the state legislature. She worked really hard to get into Congress. She had a very tough fight to get into the Senate. You don't just walk away from that. I doubt that very much. Another possibility is she's kind of clueless and thinks she's doing kind of a 90s aughts version of triangulating, and that's gonna work for her. I don't I, one may still believe in the for lack of a better word, the substance of triangulating, but politically, that does not work. That really does not work. Certainly not from a state like Arizona. Um, or she just figures, you know what? I'm not up for 2020 until 2024. I can be, Joe Democrat as soon as this is over and people will forget about this. And what are you going to do? Primary me and lose the Senate seat? And that's not, unfortunately, that's kind of, I mean, the thing is that when in theory, I mean, there's no magic about her in Arizona. So in theory, just get a better Democrat and run that person. But it's hard to come back in a close run state. It's hard to have a really brutal primary challenge and win that primary challenge and go back to like, okay, we're all happy now, we're all friends, and let's beat the Republicans. That doesn't always work. In fact, it tends not to work. So
Usually I
I
would,
don't know.
number 3 is kind of my natural inclination and what I've been thinking. And I'm also very much of the camp that people love to say this will bite them in their next election. And it's like people don't have that long of attention spans. Like I don't think so. But if anyone was going to be an exception, I think it would be her. She has angered so many Democrats, and I think it's because people are smart enough to know when you're opposed to something most of the Democratic Party is for because you're from West Virginia or because you are a more conservative Democrat, and they're smart enough to watch Kelly not take that stance. I mean, she's got a 1-to-1 comparison
Yep.
working.
Yep.
So, I mean, if there's any kind of good way to make sure that people remain pissed off with her from now until the midterm or until 2024, it's going to be deciding to be a fly in the ointment during this, very brief and fleeting window for Democrats to actually get meaningful legislation across the line.
Yeah, no, absolutely not. Yeah, not at all. So walk us through w- w- what's the kind of game plan? What's the timeline over the next week or so? Where's this stuff going?
Right. So there's been some speculation that Schumer will file for cloture on Thursday. So towards the end of the week, kind of ending this amendment process, bringing up that final 60 plus vote threshold, and then leading us to the final vote on the bipartisan bill sometime this weekend. So we'll see. I mean, that it might be somewhat optimistic. Senator Enzi died recently from Wyoming, and his funeral's on Friday. So a lot of people want to go to that funeral, which might throw a wrench in the works. I saw some concern that, if that houseboat thing turned into a super spreader, that
Right,
might throw a wrench into the works. But
right.
that doesn't seem out of the realm of possibility for timing right now. And then
So
I think
relatively soon.
relatively soon. And then
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think we'll see what happens to the August recess. I think lawmakers love to say, well, except for cinema, I will stay, I'll work through. And then as soon as the recess comes closer, like, oh man, I really want to go home.
Right,
So
right, right.
we'll
Well,
kind of see.
it's also not like there's anything like set in stone. It has to be these days in August and not those
Right.
days in August. I mean, they can
True.
be and they can also speed things up when they want to.
Right.
Now, obviously, do you need both parties? But at a certain point, you're going to have a situation where Republicans want to leave too,
Right.
and so everybody's incentives get a little squishy.
Exactly. And then we also obviously have reconciliation going on, but we are kind of at a point where, it's heavy staff involvement, it's heavy lobbyist involvement when you're getting into the nitty gritty, the particulars. So, and that is going to earnestly take some time. So,
Right,
I
right,
think what people are kind of hoping is that there is some kind of strong top line unification. This is what we're going to do. They'll go on recess. Their staffs will keep actually working on the text and everything, and then
right.
be ready to roll kind of August, September, looking to get that passed.
And so I guess the idea being to the extent that the Democrats can send a strong signal to everyone else and to themselves, like we know what we're going to do.
Hmm.
It may take us a little longer than we thought, but we know what we're going to do, and kind of it's happening.
Right.
That kind of gives them a little more flexibility because obviously, I mean, there's no there's no absolute time limits here. It's a kind of a political getting into the next year. You know, uh, people start worrying about the next election. So that gives you a little more flexibility.
All right. So now let's move on to January 6th, the investigation of which started publicly last week with a hearing where, they brought in various police officers who were there on January 6th. I was on vacation, but, have kind of caught up. And I've heard from a lot of people that they were surprised by how much it moved them, by how emotional it was. A lot of the officers started crying when they shared their experiences. And even though we'd heard, I think, the contours of a lot of these stories before, because these officers in particular have been those who have been kind of more willing to talk to the press, talk to representatives. But, hearing stories about them being called vile racist epithets and being squished in the door and everything. I mean, to me it almost reminds me of those early days of the second impeachment trial when they showed us the footage from the insurrection that we hadn't seen before,
Right.
Mitt Romney almost running into them, things like that. I was shocked at how deeply shaken I was after watching those things, because you're like, you know in some part of your brain this is what happened, but seeing it specifically or hearing the details is just a different experience.
I think also one of the things that showed, although it's less, uh, significant in a way, is that not having, we know they do have Republicans on the committee. They don't have any pro insurrection
Right.
Republicans on the committee. And I think one of the things you saw is that when you have that, and normally you're supposed to have sort of both sides there, right? But in the current environment, when you don't have half the time going to people who, I mean, what are you going to say, right? You're going to say like, "Oh, cry more, snowflake," right? I mean, but basically they do, right? And when you don't have one side kind of trying to make the process a joke, trying to kind of filibuster in the old sense of the word, it's different, right? It's different. I mean, like there was, even during the impeachment hearings in the House, second time. Wait, I'm losing track now. No, first time. Uh, when you have half the people there, again, just saying a lot of nonsense to make the whole thing seem stupid and just make it a joke. When you don't have that, it makes it a lot more powerful.
Hmm.
And Republicans brought that on themselves. They could have they could have had they could have had their pro-insurrection Republicans. They just couldn't have it with people like Jim Jordan.
Right.
And speaking of Jim Jordan, I mean, this is one of the main reasons I wanted us to kind of come back to this for a bit in this episode. Since that happened, and since the whole drama about his not being allowed to be on the committee, it's become more apparent he's a witness. There's been this series of interviews he's done. Maybe he won't do any more, but series of interviews he did over the last week, where first he just kind of let it slip that he was talking to Trump on the day. Then he admitted he talked more than once, and then trying to kind of ignore the question and blah 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 blah. I think I think there's something happening here where this subject, I mean, Trump is putting it back into the center of the political discussion because he's saying that Republicans need to support it, basically. But what's become clear here is that there is a real investigation. And there are a lot of Republican elected officials who are at least witnesses and maybe perpetrators in this. And they got themselves to a situation where it's a real investigative committee. There's no one on it to run interference for them. If anything, the Republicans on it are even more gung ho. I mean, it's hard to say they're more gung ho than the Democrats, but no less. I mean, Liz Cheney's in this for keeps. She's basically torched her career over this. She wants people to go down.
I mean, she's the first one who called she said Jordan may be a material witness, so yeah, he shouldn't be on the committee.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, and it's one of these things when you know subpoenas are going to come, and you know that they're actually, there's a certain sense in which it's kind of not really a bipartisan committee because we're sort of defining partisanship these days by, are you against the insurrection or for it, right? But there are Republicans, and not just, I mean, Liz Cheney is an extremely conservative Republican, and I do think that there are key political figures here who have their hands dirty from what happened here. And Trump is trying really hard to make support of the insurrection a kind of a central element of Republican political affiliation. And they kind of want to do that, but not quite as much as Trump wants. And I think they're in a bad spot. And I think they're right to think they're in a bad spot.
And I just simply cannot emphasize enough, like, how many times are we told Mitch McConnell is the most savvy legislator? He is untapped genius. No one like him. No one will ever be like him. This whole situation could have been avoided. Republicans did not have to deal with this. The first committee that Nancy Pelosi was championing would have been staffed by outside experts. Republican appointees would have a subpoena over or a veto over any subpoenas they wanted to send out. They could have put whoever they freaking wanted on the committee, and it didn't pass the Senate because McConnell moved against it. I'm sorry, but that has to be part of the conversation. It's like Republicans are in this terrible position and they did it 100% to themselves. Like, they really saved Democrats from themselves on this one because they were all for a committee that would have been useless and got
Yeah,
nothing done. So,
absolutely. Absolutely. Absolutely.
all right.
Okay. So
So,
next topic.
the pandemic, I
Yeah.
would say. So, like we kind of alluded to at the top of the show, we're now in this weird limbo extended pandemic time where most people who want the vaccine have been able to get it. We kind of moved out of our scarcity phase into our hesitation phase, and even more than hesitation, then we still have Republican corners actively urging people not to get vaccinated, positing being vaccinated as a theft of your personal freedoms, liberties, un-American, liberal, take your pick. So now we're in this weird situation where, as Joe Biden said, we've got a pandemic of the unvaccinated, huge case numbers in parts of the country where a lot of people are unvaccinated. And then because of that, we've got kind of room for variants to run, which is scary because there's always the fear that the vaccines won't be effective against all of these variants. And then we also kind of, like you said, there are some breakthrough cases which we knew were a possibility, and they are in some ways really good lessons to get the vaccine, because people who test positive, even older people, are saying they don't feel good, but they're not hospitalized, they're not really
Right.
sick, they're not dying.
I
But
mean, I
that's where
know
we are.
a
Yeah.
friend of mine whose father is 95, currently has a case of COVID in Florida, and thank God that, I mean, look, 95 is very old, so any illness is a
Hmm.
very touch and go thing. But at least from what I've sensed, he seems like he'll be okay, right? And that is a pretty big testament to the vaccine that
Totally.
you can get COVID at 95 and you're going to get through it and not even be hospitalized. I mean,
Right.
so yeah, and we do, and it is clear that the Delta variant does knock down the efficacy of the vaccines to some extent, not a big extent, but some real extent. Um, and the other thing, the other thing I wanted to mention that I think is important for understanding what's going on here. Florida is a relatively unvaccinated state relative to the rest of the country, but it's not as bad as some other states. So I mean, it is overperforming with COVID relative to its vaccination status. And I think what that tells us is that it's not just vaccination; it's vaccination with behavior. And behavior doesn't mean, everybody needs to be locked down or they're constantly wearing masks or blah, 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 blah. But there's just edge case things. Like, are you going to go to a nightclub unmasked and just party all night long? Maybe. But like, how many people are going to do that? Right. Or do it when there's other unvaccinated people there. Or, you go to the supermarket. Do you wear a mask? Just little flimsy little surgical mask, things like that. It's a combination of low vaccination, kind of easy lift mitigation behavior. Those things add up, and that's for those outs for not where, or at least most of us at TPM are in New York City. New York City announced just in the last 24 or 48 hours, starting next month, basically most indoor things you're going to need to be vaccinated. Go to a restaurant, go to a performance, you're going to need to show your vaccine passport. um and that's going to be an interesting thing, because I think that will keep cases down. I think it'll also drive a lot of people to get vaccinated,
100%. Yeah. I mean, and
because if you can't
obviously,
go out to dinner, that's a bummer.
right. And the big part of kind of what you're saying is like the reason that going to a nightclub is not safe if you're vaccinated is because of the unvaccinated people. And I think that's really frustrating. And I do think that people who feel that I sacrificed a year and a half of my life, I stayed home, I was responsible, I got the vaccine as soon as I could, and now you're still telling me there's stuff I can't do because other people won't get the vaccine. I think that's a real frustration that has been glossed over a bit in this kind of abundance of think pieces about you need to understand where they're coming from. You need to understand the MAGA point of view, which has been a theme since Trump came on the scene, kind of this browbeating of kind of blue state liberal people to be like, you must understand where they're coming from. And that's why when I saw the New York thing, I was so pleased, because it feels to me that there's been this fear of the right wing reaction of putting in vaccine mandates or vaccine passports that has caused people instead to do mask mandates, which is back to that original frustration, which is both masks don't work as well as vaccines. And also, again, you're putting strictures on the behavior of people who did everything that you asked them to do.
Hmm.
And so I think the New York thing, I think, is going to be fodder on Fox News from now until forever. They're going to compare it to Nazi Germany and everything, but they were doing that already, and they were already conflating mask mandates with vaccine passports. And I just think kind of governing in this defensive crouch from what Fox News is going to say is just never going to work. They will always find fuel to be outraged about whether or not it's true. And at some point we got to end the pandemic.
Hmm.
We can't just let it continue forever because a good part of the country now aligns their political identity with putting other people in danger.
It's I think this is the biggest error that we have collectively made as a country in the vaccine period, for lack of a better word, from the beginning of this year, that we have consistently placed the burden of non-vaccination on the vaccinated.
Yep.
And that does a number of very negative things. One, it creates, I mean, the incentive to get vaccinated is not to get sick and die, right?
Yeah.
But clearly that is not a significant incentive for some people. So you need to create more incentives, and some of them have to be sticks, not just carrots.
Hmm.
The other thing, though, is you create this situation, you create no incentives for the vaccinate, no burden. You don't put the weight of the burden on the people who are causing the problem, the unvaccinated. And you also create this perverse sort of demoralization among the vaccinated,
Hmm.
and kind of, you breed a sort of contempt on the part of the vaccinated towards public authorities. It's like, wait a second, I got vaccinated, why am I having to put on a mask again?
Hmm.
And again, it's this misassignment of the burden. Put the burden of non-vaccination on the non-vaccinated. Fine. You don't want to get vaccinated? Don't go to any indoor public places, except maybe a few that are, you're not going to say you can't go to the hospital or can't go to the doctor, or maybe, if you need to go to the DMV or something like that. But like going to a rock concert, going to a nightclub, or going out to dinner, no, because why do vaccinated people have to deal with your stupidity?
Yep.
Deal with it on your own, and that is both the most equitable way to do it. It's also the way to get people vaccinated, because there's definitely one of the other errors we've made is that there's really two issues. There's not vaccine hesitancy. There's one group that is hesitant, that is disproportionately young, and it's disproportionately African American and Hispanic. And that group is proper. If you poll them, very few of those people say, never getting vaccinated, man. It's like, I haven't gotten around to it yet. I'm a little, it's a new thing. I'm a little worried about the new technology. I can't get time off work. We know that in the African American community, there's a lot of history of relationship with public health, which may not be directly applicable to here, but it's a hurdle that is real. And then you have a resistance problem of people saying, nope, never going to get vaccinated, never going to happen. And those people are overwhelmingly white and conservative, and they tend to be middle aged, my age. I mean, I'm like the poster boy for non-vaccination. Only I'm vaccinated. Not the conservative part, but everything else. And yeah, it's really that you you the public policy has to be, you put the burden of non-vaccination on the non-vaccinated. Everything else screws everything up, because look, at a certain point, if you have a situation where everybody's got to wear masks, then look, it is what it is, right? I mean, if it's really necessary, but it's not necessary. Because if you're in a restaurant with only vaccinated people, there's not no risk, but pretty close to no risk. So
Right.
yeah,
And I totally agree with all that. And it's also just, there's no other option. You can make people mask up from now until kingdom come. Great. That'll prevent some spread, from the unvaccinated people, but that's not going to end the pandemic. And also, have we've just seen the myriad problems with trying to enforce a mask mandate on people who see resisting it as part of their political identity. That's why we keep seeing people get in brawls on airplanes and fight people at stores. I mean, it's also, that's just not a fair thing to put on people to enforce, to tell these kind of violently adamant people, you must be wearing a mask. It's just, we've seen the problem that creates.
well, it's also
So,
it is too, and this is something that I think that the public health authorities have sort of missed or not been sufficiently focused on, is that it goes without saying the people who won't get vaccinated definitely aren't wearing masks.
right.
It's part of the same identity, right?
Exactly.
So it's not like, kind of like, oh, I'm not getting vaccinated, but I'm definitely going to wear a mask because I don't want to endanger you. I mean, come
Exactly.
on, right?
Exactly.
There was even like a poll out today that said, some big poll, like, the non-vaccinated are less likely to wear masks than the vax. I mean, no shit. No shit, right? I mean, that's totally obvious. I mean, it's just totally obvious. So the idea that you're going to say like, "Hey, vaccinated people, you could not wear masks." Oh, bummer, unvaccinated. You got to still keep wearing. I mean,
Right. Exactly. The end result, as we all know, is just going to be people who already got vaccinated, who did what they were supposed to do, now have to wear masks again, which, again, the demoralization thing. Like, the reason why you did all this stuff, you got a shot that kind of hurt and made you sick, and you stayed in your house for years because that was socially responsible. That was the right thing to do. And just it really just blows my brain that, in some parts of the country now the response is just, yep. Well, now you have to continue to suffer indefinitely because
yeah,
a
and
good
and
chunk of the country is being irresponsible.
and again, to me, we don't know where COVID is going, right? It is we're COVID is going to do what it wants to do. And we may have a variant that escapes the vaccines. We could have future we don't know what's going to happen, and we're going to have to deal with whatever happens. But again, right now, we are here because of the unvaccinated. It's their fault. And so they've got to you know, carry the burden for it. So
Yep.
let's get to questions. Coming
So
to the end of the episode here.
our first is from Stuart, who says, uh, nope, skipped. Our first is from Dan, who says, "But do you think it was a mistake for the CDC to tell people they could stop wearing masks if they're vaccinated?" Which is kind of in line with everything that we just said. Which, to me, I think no, because I think you have to give people incentives to act responsibly, and people who did act responsibly should then be the beneficiaries of those incentives, which include not having to wear a mask.
I think it was. I think it may have been slightly premature, but I think the only real issue is it made sense to say and make a rule to the extent that the CDC or whatever makes a rule that, hey, if you're not vaccinated, you can you don't have to wear a mask. You don't have to wear a mask. You at least don't have to wear a mask around other non-vaccinated people. Um, but they they didn't I mean, when that guidance came out, the response of all the different municipalities and states was like, dude, masks are done. And everybody's like, awesome. There wasn't even really an attempt to say like, hey, if you're not vaccinated, you still got to wear a mask. I mean, it wouldn't have mattered, but they, you know what I'm saying? They weren't even saying that. So the real problem is, yes, it made sense to do that, but it was obvious that if you didn't have a way to know and to litigate who's vaccinated and who's not, that just meant that all mitigation was going to stop, even though a big chunk of the population, some beyond their choice, i.e., kids under 12, couldn't get vaccinated yet. So that just didn't make sense, because again, you created a situation where the non-vaccinated could screw everything up for everyone else, and there was no way to police the non-vaccinated doing that. And the problem we have now is that Delta is spreading like wildfire among the unvaccinated, and it's spreading so much that it is lapping up onto the shores of the vaccinated. Still a lot of protection, but when it's going, it's sort of like, I think a lot of the doctors and epidemiologists kind of compare it to, it's like a great raincoat, right? You have your vaccination is a great raincoat, right? But if you fucking go into a hurricane, you're probably still going to get wet. And certainly if you jump in the ocean, you're going to get wet, right? So I think without dealing with the issue of restricting the activities of the non-vaccinated, it was just an incomplete policy. That's how
I
I would
guess
put
my
it.
question is just what's your alternative though? So you tell people you get vaccinated and you have to continue wearing a mask indefinitely. I mean,
Well,
I
no, I
know that
think I think there's a couple things. I think that one thing is there's mandates, and there's just what's smart, right? Um, I still when I go to the supermarket, I wear a mask. It's I don't mind. It's just a little more protection. It's fine for me. I don't think other people should be forced to do that. That's just my level of risk aversion. Um, I think it I don't think it's that everyone has to wear a mask, but you have to have a policy that is kind of like, if you're not vaccinated, you can't come and hang with people who are vaccinated.
totally agree. Yep. Okay, and now our second question, looping back to Stuart, who says, "Big business and the people who own America, the 1%, are hugely powerful. They surely can't be happy about what a COVID resurgence would do to their profit. So why isn't the Chamber of Commerce, etc., doing everything possible to get people vaccinated? I have trouble believing that they're totally cowed by Trump and the MAGA world." Which this is a really interesting question to me because this was kind of an area that I got wrong. I thought that early in the pandemic, way before we had vaccines developed, I thought that the economic drivers of having society vaccinated would be so much stronger than any other, identity inclination, political inclination, that Republicans too would hop on board in the interest of getting businesses back on their feet and kind of recharging the economy. And that's a space that I have continued to be kind of surprised, even though, I think it is the more mainstream Republican position to still say you should get vaccinated. It is definitely still more of a fringe element to say that's taking away your freedom, blah blah blah. We have Republican senators kind of making PSA videos all the time about it, but it does kind of show the divide, the really fundamental divide between new Republicans and old Republicans who are kind of, in bed with big business and who have, these corporate relationships that kind of guide their political instincts.
Well, I think first of all, you are seeing now, especially with in the light of the news that the FDA is going to probably give a final authorization for the COVID vaccines beginning of next month. Even though there was that court case in Texas, that's going to free up a lot of organizations and businesses. Just say you got to do it. It's a condition of employment. So I do think you are seeing now corporate America kind of starting to
Yep.
push this, but I think it's also an example of the the Republican Party, in some ways when it comes to certain aspects of tax policy, yes, it's really controlled by the very wealthy who want low taxes and all that kind of stuff. But the Republican Party is not ruled by corporate America. That's not how it works. It doesn't it simply doesn't follow a lot of narrowly pro corporate, kind of pro economic growth policies. I mean, Trump made that clear in a lot of ways. A lot of stuff he did that was great for those people, but a lot of the trade stuff was not. And I think we just all you have to do is look at at um, at 2020 to see that's just not how it works. Um, there are a lot of drivers of public policy on the Republican side that are not lined up with corporate boardrooms. Just not. I mean, again, as you say, if it would have been the case, we would have had a thing kind of like, starting in March or kind of whenever, vaccines became semi-plentiful, uh, of just saying everybody's got to get everybody's got to get vaccinated. That's how it is. Mandate this, mandate that. If you want to work, you want to do anything, you have to do it, and that didn't happen. So the Republican Party is not just driven by uh, corporate boardrooms in the way that some people think.
Well, and I also think it is a statement on how much the culture wars have kind of taken over, especially that emphasis of the Republican Party, the corporate kind of cronyism. And now it's all about what can you kind of stoke the the working class white people to be mad about.
Hmm.
And that, time and time again, is your individual liberty, your individual freedom. What you personally want to do is more important than the collective good. And in this case, that manifested in a way that, was kind of anti economic growth.
Yep. Yep, absolutely. All right. So let me remind everybody that the Josh Marshall podcast is brought to you by Grady's Cold Brew Iced Coffee. You can get 25% off your first order at Grady'sColdBrew.com with promo code TPM. And this is the last week we're going to be accepting submissions for our theme song contest. So if you've been waiting around, definitely get it in. Definitely get it in now. And I guess we'll talk to you next week.
Yeah. Talk to you next week. Thanks,
All
everybody.
right. Later, folks.